Welcome to this video tutorial brought to you by tutvid.com. In this tutorial we're going to go over the tools palette and learn about all the basic tools that you're going to need to know how to use to start using Photoshop effectively. The tools in Photoshop are what allow you to make the changes necessary to edit photos and create graphics and do all sorts of neat things with your photos. Now, the tools that we will be using in Photoshop to edit photos and graphics are found in what is called the Tools palette. Now this is located over on the left hand side of your screen, right over here. Now this Tools palette is broken up into several areas. Adobe has sort of subdivided all of the tools and grouped them according to the tool type roughly. Okay, the first section up here, these are the selection tools. You're going to use these tools to make various selections, as well as there's the cropping tool up here and the move tool, where you're actually going to use that to move sections of your photo if you want to cut something out. That's the tool that you're going to move with. Okay, the second area here, this is the retouching and painting tools section. Virtually every tool in this section allows you to use a brush of some sort, except for a couple of the tools. But pretty much all these tools are brushing tools and image correction tools and painting tools. So this is a very useful section. Well, all of the sections are very useful, actually, but that section is especially useful. There are a lot of tools in there that you're going to come to quite a bit, especially if you're dealing with a lot of photography. Alright, the third section, these are your vector tools. Type is vector. Vector graphics are graphics that can be scaled indefinitely. You can make them as big as you want, and they do not lose quality. And we also have our paths, the pen tool. The pen tool is a more advanced feature of the tools. We're not going to get into it on this tutorial. At some point I will make an entire video on just the pen tool. But for now, we're not going to worry about it. But the pen tool is a vector tool. And you also have your vector shape tools, which we will touch on. We have the direct selection tool, which is going to be editing whatever you draw with the pen tool. So that's a little complex. We're not going to get into that right now. But these are your vector tools. Below them, we have the navigation and information tools. You have the hand tool, which allows you to drag around your image and move around. The hand tool you're not really going to use unless you have an image that's huge. And I'll explain a little more in depth in a little bit. You also have your zooming tools and things like that. Fifth, we have down here in the fifth section our color swatches. These are your foreground and background colors, and you can swap them out easily and reset your default black and white foreground colors. You can also edit these foreground colors, but we'll get into all of that in a little bit. Below that is quick masking. We'll touch on that later on. We also have our views. Photoshop provides us with different full screen views. Right now I've got it in normal. If I were to click into either of these other views, they're both full screen views, it would move way off screen of this recording that I'm making here. So for now I'm going to leave it in the default Photoshop view. And then below that is the flip over to Image Ready button. This button opens whatever file you're working on in Image Ready, which is Photoshop's partner program. And in Image Ready there's a similar button, which is Open in Photoshop. And it does the same exact thing, just it opens that file in Photoshop instead of Image Ready. So, in order to start using any of these tools, we need to select them from the tool palette. Now, there is actually, I should say, more than one way to select any given tool from the tool palette. The obvious way would be go and click the tool and start using it. But Adobe has assigned a key to each tool, and these keys are called hotkeys, and they are huge time-saving features. Now, every tool here has a hotkey, but you're not going to be able to memorize all of these right away. It's just going to take time. I mean, you could sit down and try to memorize them all, but it's really not the most effective way to do it. The most effective way to memorize these is just use Photoshop, and you will just memorize them. You know, for example, I know that B brings me to the brush tool. That's pretty obvious because B for brush tool. G brings me to the gradient tool and the paint bucket tool. S brings me to the clone stamp tool. M brings me to the marquee tool. V brings me to the move tool. So you're going to memorize all of these things as you work more and more with Photoshop. So you don't have to worry about memorizing them all right now. Now, one little trick that the tool palette does have is it does not display every tool Photoshop has available to you in this palette right here, right now. If you notice, some of these tools have this little black arrow in the bottom right hand corner. Those tools you can click and hold, and a pop-out menu will show up with other options. For example, the marquee tool, you can make rectangular selections with the rectangular marquee tool, but you can also make circular selections with the elliptical marquee tool, and there are also the single row and single column marquee tools, which are different tools altogether, but they just select one row of pixels. But we're not going to get into them now. We're going to worry more about just the fact that you can click into, for example, the pen tool, and you have all these other tools, the gradient tool, and you also have the paint bucket tool, the patch tool here, and you have all these other tools. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're looking for a tool and you don't see it at first glance, start clicking and opening up some of these tools and looking at the subtools that are in there. Okay? Now, one thing you may notice here when I click on, let's say, the marquee tool, is these hotkeys. The M hotkey here for marquee tool is for both the rectangular and the elliptical marquee tool. So what happens if I have it set to elliptical marquee tool and I want to get to the rectangular marquee tool? Well, when I just hit M, nothing happens. What you have to do is hit Shift and the hotkey, and it switches between those tools. Now, you can change that preference. Come up here to Edit Preferences, and under General, right here, there's a checkbox, Use Shift key for tool switch. If I uncheck that, just hitting the M key numerous times will switch you between the marquee tools, or the P key will switch you between the pen tools, etc., etc., etc. So that's just something to keep in mind. I prefer to have the Shift key just so I don't accidentally switch while I'm in the middle of working. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're working on tools, especially if you're looking for a tool and you don't see it at first glance. Now, all these tools here in Photoshop are not just you click them and use them as they are. Every tool, when you select it, changes this toolbar that runs across the top of your screen, and in this toolbar are specific options and settings you can set for any of these tools. So, for example, the paintbrush tool, I can select a different brush tip, I can select opacity, I can select flow options, all kinds of different settings you can set, and every tool has different settings. Even the move tool, auto selection of layers, showing transform controls when you select something, all sorts of different things for these tools. So just keep your eye out when you're selecting things, and you'll start finding out all kinds of neat little things you can do with different tools just by glancing up into the toolbar, and you'll see different options that are available to you. So let's quickly cycle through the basic tools here to get a hang of what exactly they're capable of doing. We're going to start out with the marquee tools here at the top. That's the rectangular and elliptical marquee tools. They do virtually the same exact things, except obviously they just make different shapes. When you pull them out, the rectangular marquee tool makes square shapes. Elliptical marquee tool makes more circular shapes. So notice here in the toolbar we have a few little icons. These 4 icons here to the left-hand side. The icon that I've selected to the far left, basically when I make a selection, now if I want to make another selection, it gets rid of my first selection. Well, I have some options up here. I can choose to have Photoshop just keep adding to my selection. For example, if I make one selection and then I decide I want to make a box coming out of that, I can do that. But then, let's say I want to take something away from it. Well, the next option up here is called Subtract from Selection. If I do that, I can cut off. Whatever I select gets cut off from my selection. I could split my selection right in half and have 2 separate selections just like that. And the last option is the Intersect with Selection option, and what that does is when I draw the selection, only the parts of both my selections that go over each other, those are going to be the parts that are saved. For example, everything except those 2 ends off to the side, which are gone now, will stay. Okay, if I were to take the elliptical marquee tool and set it to intersect with selection and draw a circle like this, you're going to see it's only going to save the area where both selections intersect with each other. Okay, so if you don't quite understand what I'm talking about, just take the marquee tools and play around with them a little bit, and you'll realize very quickly what exactly it does. Okay, and the next thing here in the toolbar for the marquee tools is feathering, and basically what this does is it softens the edge of your selections. We're not going to get into detail on that right now, but as you work more with these tools, you'll realize what exactly they do. So to get a little visual on the marquee tool, what I'm going to do is come over here to the Layers palette. You can go Window, Layers, right there. And down at the bottom of the Layers palette, there's this little box next to the trash can. If you roll over it, a little tooltip comes up that says Create New Layer. Click that button, and you've created a new layer here, and on this blank layer, we're going to draw a selection. I'm going to make a box right here. Now I'm going to come up here to Edit, and I'm going to click Fill. Now, I'm going to, under contents, I'm going to say use my foreground color. In this case, my foreground color is black. So I'm going to hit OK, and it's going to fill that selection with black. All right. Now I'm going to come up to select and hit deselect. I have now deselected from that selection that I made, and we have this black square sitting there. Now, I'm going to undo that by coming up here to Edit, Undo, and I'm also going to go step backward to undo yet another step. So now I just have my selection. I'm going to come up here to Subtract from Selection and cut a hole in the center of this box. Now I'm going to come up here to Edit, Fill with foreground color. And you're going to see it's only going to fill my selected area. I'm going to deselect that using the hotkey, and that hotkey is Command if you're on the Mac or Control if you're on Windows. Control D. That's the hotkey for deselection. Okay? One last thing I want to point out is that if you have your marquee tool set to make new selections, you can, when you make a selection, move that selection around as you wish. And the way you do that is when you make that selection, when you move the mouse inside of the selection, this white cursor comes up. And it looks just like the Move tool just about. And when you click down and drag, you move the selection. You're not actually moving pixels of the image. That's a different tool altogether. This is just moving your selection. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, next up is the lasso tool. The lasso tool works a lot like the marquee tool as far as what it achieves. It gives you a selection. For example, if I wanted to cut out around these rocks here, I could use the marquee tool to get a very rough selection. The marquee tool essentially does the same thing as the lasso tool, excuse me, it does essentially the same thing as the marquee tools, except it allows you to get a free form or a freehand selection. Basically something that's just custom. There are also other options here, the polygonal and the magnetic lasso tool. The polygonal lasso tool basically just draws in straight lines. And the magnetic lasso tool kind of sticks to whatever it is you're tracing around. You can see I'm sticking to the edge of these rocks here because it's a high contrast edge. We just got the rocks and the white. And that's the magnetic lasso tool. Now, the lasso tool, you will notice, has a lot of the same options as just the regular marquee tool as far as subtracting and adding to selections, etc., etc., etc. You also have that feathering. Okay, the magic wand tool is a very interesting tool. It's another selection tool. We're still in the selection area. The magic wand tool selects pixels of the same color. For example, if I click this white background, it's going to select this entire white background here, all around my box. I'm going to deselect that. Now if I select, I'm going to shut off the box layer by clicking that little eye. I'm going to move the layers palette off screen for a minute. I'm going to click on this white background, and you're going to see it's going to select everything except the reflection and the rocks and this globe and the globe's reflection. So it has selected all of the white pixels. I'm going to bring my layers palette back on screen. I'm going to turn that box layer back on. Now, the magic wand has some unique settings here. It allows you to set tolerance, and the tolerance is how close the colors have to be before the magic wand will pick them up. The higher the tolerance is, the less close to each other the colors have to be, the less like each other those colors have to be. The lower the tolerance the magic wand will have. For example, if I just set this to 1, it will only take pure white. Like, it will not pick up any pixels of any other color. So generally it's a good idea to give yourself a tolerance of 5, 10, depending on what you're working on. If you're working on something like a sky, maybe you'll go up to like 35. But really, it's just going to be a matter of playing around with it and figuring out what works for you. Now, there are some other options here for the magic wand tool. We're not going to get into them right now. There are a little more advanced options. We're going to move on to the Move tool. Now, if you remember a second ago, I mentioned to you when we create a selection, we can then move the selection. Well, what if I actually want to cut out the center of these rocks and move it? That's what the Move tool is for. If I have the Move tool selected, I can now take with that selection, grab the center of those rocks, and move it somewhere else. I don't want to do that though. So I'm going to undo and I'm going to deselect. That's what the Move tool does. The Move tool just moves your stuff. I've got my layer 1 here selected. I don't have anything selected as an active selection. By active selection, I mean with like the marquee tool, there aren't those marching ants around anything here. But just because I've got my layer selected, I can drag my artwork around inside that layer. So that's what the Move tool does. Alright, let's move on to the brushing and retouching tools. The first tool here in the brushing and retouching tools section is the brush tool. There's also the pencil tool hidden underneath that. But the brush tool is going to be a tool that if you're doing photos, photo retouching, photo editing, you're going to use the brush tool a ton. Matter of fact, I have an entire video devoted to just the brush tool. And you're going to want to go check that out if you're going to be using the brush tool a lot, or you think you will be, but you're not sure. That's a great tool, and there's a ton you can do with it. But basically, the brush tool paints with the foreground color, and the foreground color in this case is black. And you can change brush heads by clicking on that down arrow key and selecting a brush head from your preset menu here. So the brush tool is pretty easy to start using. You just click and drag, and it's going to paint. Next, the eraser tool. The eraser tool is actually a pretty destructive tool, and as you learn more and more about Photoshop, you're going to use the eraser tool less and less and less. The eraser tool just gets rid of whatever pixels you click and drag over. It's essentially the brush tool, but instead of brushing on new pixels, it gets rid of stuff that's already there. I hardly ever use the brush tool anymore, and as you work more in Photoshop, you're going to learn techniques that are much less destructive than using the brush tool, and you will just find that you probably will not use the eraser tool very much, although it does have its uses. But what's more interesting is the eraser tool has this tool called the background eraser and the magic eraser tool. Both of those are very interesting tools. I'm not going to get into them in this tutorial because they could be an entire tutorial just themselves. They're more advanced tools, but there are some very interesting tools. Those tools you may find yourself using more and more as you work more in Photoshop and you learn what they're all about. Alright, now the paint bucket tool is the next tool we're going to look at. The paint bucket tool here is hidden underneath the gradient tool. The paint bucket tool is a pretty important tool. If you look up here in the toolbar, you can see we have foreground set as our color. That is kind of cluing me into the fact that the paint bucket tool is used to fill shapes and fill objects with the foreground color. I'm going to click on my foreground color here, and I'm just going to open up the color picker, and I'm going to choose a red. Now, I'm on layer 1 here. If I click in the center of my box here, it's going to fill that with red. Now, the thing that's kind of a little tricky about the paint bucket tool is it's like the magic wand tool in the fact that it automatically selects and fills the pixels it wants to fill. It will only select and fill pixels that are close in value. You can see just like the magic wand tool, we've got tolerance tools, we've got this anti-alias option, and we've got the contiguous option. We've got some options up here that are very similar, matter of fact they're the same as the magic wand tool. So we're not going to get into them right now, but the paint bucket tool can be used to fill your objects. And basically, if you want to fill an object, like, let me just give you a quick example. I'm going to make a selection here over this rock. Now, if I take the paint bucket tool and I just want to fill that selection with red, I'm on the background layer. See, it's going to give me this dodgy, spotty stuff, and I don't want that. If I want this to be a solid fill, you should come up here to Edit and go to Fill and hit Fill with Foreground Color. That's going to give you a solid fill. The hotkey for that, by the way, is Alt or Option Backspace. It's a quick way to fill your selections with color. Now, you don't have to worry about that when you're working on a blank layer. I'm going to shut off my background layer for a second. As you can see, this is a complete transparent layer except for this box we have in place. And anything I draw out here, you're going to see, I can just grab the paint bucket tool and fill it. Whoops, wrong layer. There we go. I can just grab the paint bucket tool and fill it, and it's no problem. So you just have to be worried about using the paint bucket tool when you're using it over an image where you've got various colored pixels and things like that. That's the only thing. Alright, next up is the gradient tool. The gradient tool is a very interesting tool. It allows you to fill your selections with a gradation of 2 or more colors. And the end result is this fade effect as both colors fade into each other. And it can yield some very interesting looks. So let's take a look at the gradient tool right now. It can actually be a pretty tricky tool to master, and if you're just starting out, it's going to be quite difficult to understand. I'm going to make a selection down here, and we're going to apply a gradient to the selection. Okay, let's grab the gradient tool. Now you can see up here in the toolbar we have a small preview of the gradient. Now in order to edit this gradient, we need to click that preview, and up pops the gradient editor. We're going to select a simple black to white gradient here. Now you can see that we have these two little arrows. These are called color stops. Don't worry about the color stops on top. Those are opacity stops. Those are a little more complicated. We're just going to worry about color for now. In order to edit your gradient, you need to click these color stops, double click them, excuse me, and up pops the color picker. In this case, we're going to do a yellow gradient, a yellow to orange gradient. So I'm going to pick an orange. Okay, so I just double clicked on this one, chose my color, double clicked on this one, and chose an orange. All right, now you can make gradients of more than just two colors. And we can do that by simply clicking down here on the bottom anywhere we like, and it adds new color stops, and we can then double click these color stops and edit the color. Just like that. Now if you have color stops that you want to get rid of, you can just click the color stop, drag it straight down, and it will just yank it off the line. Just like that. Okay? So once we have this gradient that we like, we're going to come up here to the top right hand corner here and hit OK. That is now our active gradient. You can see it there. We have this linear gradient selected. We're not going to worry about these other types of gradients. And now we're just going to click down on the gradient button. I'm clicking and holding my mouse, and I'm just going to drag it straight across this rectangle. Now you can hold down the Shift key, and that will keep the gradient in a perfectly straight line. You're going to feel it. Your mouse is going to snap, and it's not going to let you move anywhere else. It constrains you to 45-degree increments, so the next place it would move would be 45 degrees downhill, or if I moved up, uphill. We just want it to stay straight at a flat 90 degrees. Then I'm going to let go. And you can see it fills my selection with this gradient. I will now deselect using Command or Control D, and I've deselected. Alright, so that's basically how you use the gradient tool. It's not that hard, and play around with it, mess around with it a little bit, and you'll be applying gradients to everything before you know it. Alright, so that's it for the retouching tools as far as what we're going to get into now. We're going to look at the type tool here in the vector tools section. Now the type tool is actually really easy to use. You just click anywhere to start using it and type whatever you want. In this case, I'm going to type tutvid.com. Whoops. There we go. Tutvid.com. Now, when you do this, you can then select the text and change the color by clicking the little color swatch up there in the type toolbar, right up here up top. You can change the size. I'm going to up the size a slight bit. We can change it from regular to italic or bold and italic. You can change the font. And when you're finished doing all that, you need to make sure you hit this little check button here off to the right hand side. That will commit any current edits you make. I'm now going to just grab my move tool and move it over to the middle of our little box. Now anytime you want to edit text, you just double click the little thumbnail, and here you are, you're back. You can edit your text. Always make sure you press the check when you're done editing text, so it allows you to get out of it. Alright, the next tool we're going to look at over in the vector shapes area is the shape tool. This tool allows you to draw paths, which you don't know about yet, but if we get to a video on the pen tool, we will talk all about paths. But it also allows you to, whoops, we don't want to do that. It also allows you to draw filled shapes, which are just colored boxes or rounded rectangles or circles or custom shapes or lines or whatever you want in there as well. So that's a very neat tool. Now, drawing as these filled pixels, that is not vector. Even though this is in the vector tools, the vector tools are the shape layers and the paths. That's where you have your vector going on. Over in fill pixels, that just makes a bitmap graphic. But you're not just limited to rectangles and rounded rectangles. There also is the custom shape tool, and the custom shape tool has this whole library of different shapes that you can access here, and these are all default shapes in Photoshop. If you have Photoshop, you have these shapes, and you can access them by clicking this little arrow here in the top left hand or top right hand corner, excuse me, of your custom shapes drop down box here. And down here at the bottom, you have all of these libraries of shapes. You just click any one of these, let's say music, and it's going to ask me if I want to replace the current shapes with the shapes from music.csh, and I'm going to hit OK. Now, save changes from the current shapes. No, I don't want to save changes. And here, I've got all these different musical notes and notation and shapes, all of these custom shapes that I can just grab. I can drag them right out here. Hold Shift if you want to constrain to the proper proportions as far as making it look more like a musical symbol, not a tic-tac-toe chart. Now, there is right here next to the custom shapes option here in the toolbar a little drop down menu, and these are your geometry options. If you would like to constrain your proportions, you can set all those options right in here. So you can go in there and mess around with some options and really figure out what does what. Now, one thing I do want you to take note is notice as I've been switching through these tools, this toolbar up here is switching to accommodate whatever tool I have selected. Even right here, with the custom shape tool selected, if I come over here and select the rectangle tool, my custom shape selection goes away because I don't need it anymore. Matter of fact, I can't use it with the rectangle tool. It's not the custom shape tool. So you have all kinds of options and things that change here as you're working through these tools. So always, always, always keep a lookout on that toolbar, and you'll find all kinds of interesting things happening all the time as you work through whatever you're working on. Alright, so next up is the eyedropper tool. The eyedropper tool is what you're going to use to get color. When I click any color here on my screen, I can even click outside of my Photoshop window. If I've got a web browser open or if I want to get any color from anywhere, I can click anywhere and it's going to make that color my foreground color. For example, if I want this middle orange here, I've now made that my foreground color. Now, you can Alt-click, and holding down Alt or Option if you're on the Mac and clicking, that's going to make that color your background color. And another tool here in the information and navigation section is the hand tool. Now the hand tool does not seem very useful at first glance. For example, it's doing absolutely nothing for me here. But when it does get useful is when you zoom way in and you're working on something and you need to click and drag around in your image. It is extremely helpful. And the nice thing about the hand tool is whatever tool you're using, let's say I'm using the brush tool and I'm painting something in here, I can just hold down the space bar and it temporarily switches me to the hand tool so I can move. Then when I let go of space, it gives me my brush tool back so I can keep working. So this makes for working in close quarters and working on big images. It makes it super easy because you can just scoot around and do what you need to do. And space bar, holding it down, use a hand tool to move yourself around, let go of the space bar, and you're back to whatever tool you were just using. So it's very, very nice. One other tool here, the zoom tool. The zoom tool zooms you in, zooms you out. Usually what I use instead of the zoom tool is the hotkeys, which are Command or Control, plus or minus. They just zoom you in or out. Okay. Next, color swatches. These color swatches are very important. These are our foreground and background colors. If you hit D, it restores your default foreground and background colors, which are black and white. If you hit X, it switches them. Okay, it swaps them out. So now my foreground color is white, my background is black, and they're black and white. Instead of using D, which is the hotkey for default, you can hit this little icon here in the bottom left-hand corner. That gives you your default colors again as well. Or instead of hitting X to swap your colors, you can just hit that little arrow. That swaps your colors as well. In order to switch different foreground or background colors, just click on the swatch and come up here into your color picker, drag the hue slider up and down, and then pick your saturation and brightness of your color and hit OK. And you can select the background color and same thing. Just like that, I'm going to hit the little button there to switch me back to my default colors. It's a good idea to keep a watch on your colors here and always know what colors you're using. If you're masking or painting or whatever you're doing, it's always a good idea to be able to quickly get in and alter the colors you're using. Now, the quick masking, the views, and the switching over to image ready buttons, all of that stuff, it's not really something that you're going to use immediately in Photoshop. It's not basic stuff. Although the views, these are just different views Photoshop has. You can play around with them and see what they are. They're just other full screen views. Switching over to image ready takes this file and opens it in image ready, and nothing much to it. Quick masking, that's another world in and of itself, which we will get to in another tutorial, another video at some point. But for now, that's it for the basic tools of Photoshop. So I hope that over the last few minutes, you've come from not really knowing much about the tools of Photoshop to getting ready to get into Photoshop and do something yourself. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something from it. And please go check the site out. That is www.tutvid.com. And thank you for watching.